What's up, heathens? How y'all doing? I'm the Godless engineer, and I critically analyze apologist claims to give you the best arguments and information so that you can stand up and use your voice. So recently, there's been a bit of drama. People have been misrepresenting me or my position left and right. And today, we are going to be discussing Captain Dadpool's video. He apparently thinks that I viciously attacked him like a dog attacking a groundhog. And what exactly was this vicious attack that I launched against him? I showed that he only had an ad populum reason for disregarding mythicism. Now keep in mind, I don't mind that people adhere to the historicist position due to the consensus, but the difference is that Dadpool regularly makes arguments against the mythicist position. If you're going to be doing that, I feel like you should have better reasons for disregarding mythicism than just how popular it is. If you want to fuck around and find out how Dadpool responds to my vicious attack, then please stay tuned.
Oh, John, have you missed me? I'd say so. I know you made a bunch of TikToks about me. I know that because I get notifications about them. I just ignore them. What I didn't know is how many YouTube videos you've been making about me. 1, 2, 3. That's the interview we did. We'll get that in a minute. 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10.
You know, it's funny because I did the one live stream with Captain Dadpool, and then I made 2 other videos about his arguments. And that's it. The other videos that appeared in the search were just clips taken from those previously produced videos on my Clips channel. So I haven't really been paying a lot of attention to him since he blocked me on Twitter for calling him out for misrepresenting his dog attacking a groundhog. In case you're not up to date on that particular piece of drama, he posted up a video on TikTok of his dog attacking a groundhog, and then when he got pushback on TikTok about it, he went to Twitter, didn't post the original video, and just claimed that people were attacking him because his dog barked at a groundhog, which just simply was not the case. And once I posted the original video on Twitter, people seemed to agree with me. I just really don't like dishonesty or creators misrepresenting things to their audience. Of course, I'm always looking for good videos to use as a launch pad to discuss good methodologies for doing historical research and historical criteria for affirming some historical claim. And Captain Dadpool had produced a couple of videos that allowed me to do that. And these videos were quite respectful, so I don't know why he's so upset in this video.
But I did see this clip from our interview on Neil's most recent video.
If y'all want to fuck around and find out how crazy Neil's version of reality is, then please stay tuned.
Captain Dadpool sent me your video, the one where you debunk Carrier on the for like 3 hours or whatever. It was really long.
Oh,
video.
yeah.
Oh, you mean this guy?
I have to ask. We started out this with you thinking that mythicists just sort of dismiss things. And I'm wondering if through our conversation, do you feel like I've just dismissed anything without reason?
I don't know if without reason is the best word. It's more like you have to cling to more fringe ideas in order to make them work.
The guy who had no good reason to dismiss my position other than how popular it was?
A quick bit of background before we get to the actual clip. T-Jump reached out on Twitter with saying that he had a potential debate with Richard Carrier on modern day debates and he needed some help with some information on historical criteria. And I sent that to him, and I also said if you want to get into the meat and potatoes of the mythicist position and why Carrier's arguments are flawed, I highly recommend checking out this video from Neil, who did a very thorough job explaining.
You know, it's really perplexing that anybody would think that Neil's videos had any effect on Carrier's position, considering this.
The reason why it matters is because Philo's talking about an angel who doesn't have a name at all. It's an incorporeal being with many names. It's not just specific to Zechariah.
That's a self-contradiction. You can't have an angel with no names and have many names. Bill doesn't explain numbers. Like, I don't see how that gets you numbers. What does numbers have to do with
The whole
any
point
of
of me
this?
bringing up numbers was to show you that Philo is acknowledging where all of this stuff comes from in Zechariah.
But it's not. If they're two different beings, they can't be referring to the same thing. So how is that an argument? That's what I don't understand what your argument is.
Well, because it's very Platonic, because you have different Like, and that's
not
not
answer. I don't understand. I really don't. I literally don't understand. You've made no sense to me in this video or in your video.
The number wasn't really that much of part of my argument.
I mean,
against yours.
I mean, it was really weird. I'm just saying it's really weird. And I'm still, even here, it's really weird. I literally don't understand what you're arguing or even what you're arguing against. I have no idea what you're talking about. I understand when you say sentences, I understand what those sentences mean, but I don't understand what you're supposed to infer from them, like what they even have anything to do with my argument.
But Philo's acknowledging that the verse in Zechariah originates from this verse in Numbers. That was my point.
No, he's not. He's saying it can't possibly, because it's referring to two different beings, so they cannot be referencing each other. Cannot. It's literally impossible. That's what Philo is saying. He's saying they're two different beings. I'm not saying
that it's the same being.
So I don't understand why referring to Numbers 23 helps us at all.
I don't even know why you're still that's not even,
it doesn't make any sense. Your argument
that wasn't even the crux of my argument, though. Numbers had nothing to do with what I was saying after that. That was all I was doing. All I was pointing out.
I'm asking you to explain the argument about
Numbers. I just did. All I was pointing out to you.
You just said you didn't, and now you just said you did.
Then listen to what I'm saying. Then listen to what I'm saying.
Try it again. Include the word numbers in your sentence. The more that is being said either supports or doesn't contradict anything I've said. So that's why I don't understand why you brought it up. I don't understand I still don't know what your argument is. Literally, it makes no sense. I've struggled.
I don't know what
I
else to tell you. I've explained it to you already.
I think we're at loggerheads. I don't think there's just. You can't come up with a way to frame it in English that makes any sense to me. I don't know what your argument is.
And honestly, that's all you really need to know about Neil's videos on this topic. And of course, I've made videos refuting Neil's arguments and claims against the mythicist position on the Philo topic. So if you really want to dig deep into that subject, you can go and find those videos. They're either in the description or in the cards. I added the clip of Captain Dadpool in my response to Neil because I wanted to highlight how there's no real reasonable argument against the mythicist position, just an ad populum argument. Also, keep in mind that the anti-historical resurrection position is actually fringe in New Testament scholarship as well.
But what's your understanding then of academic consensus and how it relates to this position and what possible implications of that may be? Understanding, obviously, that consensus does not equal truth.
So this is going to be the strangest thing that Mike and I have disagreed on all day. I think he's completely wrong. I think the consensus of New Testament scholars would say Jesus was raised from the dead. Because the vast majority of New Testament scholars are Christians. I mean, I'm an odd duck.
I just genuinely don't understand this whole idea that Christian scholars and some secular scholars not being convinced by the mythicist argument automatically means that mythicism is wrong. Those same Christian scholars wouldn't accept that the resurrection didn't happen, yet this is the most likely conclusion. Currently, there are at least 40 scholars that are either mythicists or sympathetic to the mythicist position. So it's definitely not that there's no support for it, it's just that there are specific people that don't support it. And for me, that's not going to be a convincing argument against the position.
Absolutely nothing to do with John. Even though John was featured in the video that Neil made, the point of sitting in the video was to help him prepare for his debate against Carrier. Nevertheless, here we are.
That's the type of individual supporting Neil's videos. Okay.
See, I agreed to go on that interview with John because I thought he was still a friend at the time. I didn't realize he was the kind of person that he is yet. And I'm not sure why he thinks this clip of me is such a gotcha because, John, I was trying to be nice. I wasn't trying to go straight to the jugular. I was trying to build a bridge of communication between the two of us.
First, as far as I understand it, there's not a debate that's been scheduled or even talked about, and the last time I heard, Carrier was doubtful that he would even debate T-Jump in the future due to some worrying information that he received. Next, I was definitely Ricky's friend at the time.
Yeah, so if anybody's curious as to what I'm drinking tonight, this is Bud Light Next. Need something that's close to water? Get Bud Light Next.
Bud Light next to water.
Bud Light next to water.
Bud Light next to nothing.
And so it frustrates me a little bit when I hear somebody that I feel like I get along with very well and I think very highly of, Captain Dadpool. I guess it grates on me a little bit to hear somebody say, oh, they're crank conspiracy theorists that only think that the Romans created Jesus.
Additionally, prior to that stream, I had helped Ricky get in touch with Bart Ehrman's representative so that he could become an affiliate for Bart's various lectures and courses, so that Ricky could use his influencer status to help make him some money, but also it opened up an avenue for him. I had also picked Ricky to moderate a debate between a historicist and Dr. Carrier the previous year. Even during the live stream with Ricky, KC was busy in the chat shilling for Ricky's channel, telling people to go and subscribe to him. So I don't know what I did that he would have said was unfriendly. I mean, I have used this clip before in order to make the exact same point, but when we did this live stream, we were definitely at least friendly acquaintances. I also don't know what he means by what kind of person I am. I'm a fucking delight and I go to bat hard for my friends, but I'm also not afraid to tell them when they're wrong or they're making a bad argument or pointing out some kind of flaw in some position they hold. I'm also very transparent on my channel. I mean, the person that you see sitting before you most times is my authentic self, maybe amplified a little bit, but that's pretty much how I feel the way that I am on camera. So I don't exactly know what he means by what kind of person I am. As for going for the jugular, I have no idea what he means by this. Why does a reasonable discussion between two people have to be going for the jugular? Is he trying to tell me that he can't be open and honest about his issues with my position without being a dick? Is that what he meant when he said that he was just being nice? I feel like you can be nice and also refute a friend's arguments at the same time. And whenever I have discussions, I don't pull my punches. I still challenge the points that I have issues with. My phrasing might change a little bit, but my points do not. And as far as being gentle goes, I was just being gentle with my clips, Ricky. Since we're pulling out all the stops now, here's a pretty good one.
By the way, everyone, I pretty much already know everything what John's going to say. He probably pretty much knows everything that I'm going to say in this discussion. So there's not much new information to say on this topic, I don't think.
1 hour later.
No, they absolutely had different interpretations of the Messiah and who was supposed to be, what he was supposed to look like in the Old Testament, but he was never interpreted to be someone who was going to be who was going to be executed on the cross by the hands of the Roman government. That was never anyone's interpretation of the Old Testament of who the Messiah was going to be.
Well,
show me if it was. And that's my point.
Wisdom of Solomon.
Wisdom of Solomon?
Yeah.
How so?
Well, I mean, it's a Jewish document, right?
Yes. Where does it mention the Messiah being crucified, or
it mentions the Messiah being put to a shameful death. And it also, in the Talmud, there are two Messiahs, where one Messiah was to die, and then one Messiah was to resurrect. So
I'll look into those.
Okay, yeah, definitely do. It's Wisdom of Solomon, chapter 2, I believe. But on my GE Shorts channel, I actually put out a video today.
I can't grab it.
Oh. I put out a video on the GE Shorts channel today that kind of lays out the case for them totally expecting the Messiah to be not necessarily specifically Roman crucified, but put to a shameful death. And it's very obvious when you read like Isaiah 53 that it could easily be interpreted as being, a messianic, talking about Jesus and everything like that. So, I mean, I think that there's definitely enough material there to give these early Jews the inclination that Jesus was going to be disrespected and put to death in a shameful way. I totally get being skeptical, and I totally think that you should look into the things that I'm talking about.
This is fun.
I was talking to you the exact same way I talk to Christian apologists when I go on their channels. Well, I'm going to be a little bit less cordial this time because, yes, mythicists absolutely dismiss the data.
Oh, okay. So now he's saying that during that discussion, he wasn't really going all that hard against my position. But now in this video, he's bringing the pain. And to start this pain off, you're going to say something you already mentioned in that discussion?
It seems, from my perspective, the mythicist is the one who has the most assumptions. The mythicist position is the one that dismisses the most amount of evidence that we have for the existence of a historical figure named Jesus.
1 hour later!
And I'm wondering if through our conversation, do you feel like I've just dismissed anything without reason?
I don't know if without reason is the best word. It's more like you have to cling to more fringe ideas in order to make them work.
Way to go hard there, Ricky. The only thing that he really changed was he made it sound a bit more dramatic than it actually is. But it seems like now he's saying that there are some things that are being dismissed without good reason. So which one is it? Also, another thing, in that interview, Ricky starts out in the exact same position and then ends up totally reversing his position that he started with. You know, I feel like I'm getting a little bit of whiplash here. In any case, I can't wait to hear the exact same arguments that we heard last time, except this time it's done with more feeling and aggravation, where he's going for the jugular even harder than he did last time.
Now, I have Carrier's book. I've read it. I got highlights and shit in it. I've done the work. Now, there are mythicists out there like John that make mythicism their whole ass personality. And then there's mythicists that just don't buy it. So I'm going to explain something to you guys. The mythicist position hinges on taking a passage from Philo and combining it with a passage from the Ascension of Isaiah and combining them and reciting them both at the same time in Latin while you spin around and throw salt over your shoulder, and boom, that's where we get a sect of Jews that believed in Jesus specifically as a pre-incarnate being that would be executed in the firmament.
So I want y'all to keep in mind that he held up Carrier's book. He showed that he highlighted some passages in Carrier's book, because I feel like by the end of this video, you may understand why I think that Ricky hasn't actually read Carrier's book like completely, or at the very least, he hasn't understood the position. I mean, if he had actually understood everything that he read in Carrier's book or read Carrier's book, then this particular part of the live discussion probably shouldn't have happened.
Within 70 years of Jesus' supposed death, you have like almost a dozen different sources, not including the Gospels. If this person of Jesus was made up out of nowhere, why did they invent a carpenter or a laborer from a small town that was crucified by the Roman government? Why is that what they came up with instead of this mighty powerful person?
And in that live stream, I did feel like Dadpool wasn't exactly listening to what I was saying.
Basically, with the crucifixion being like a very embarrassing kind of death or whatnot. Yeah. I mean, the way that they were interpreting their scriptures, that had to happen. And all of the miracles that Jesus did, all of those are taken straight out of the Old Testament scriptures.
Interpretations of the Messiah who was supposed to look like in the Old Testament, but he was never interpreted to be someone who was going to be who was going to be executed on the cross by the hands of the Roman government. That was never anyone's interpretation of the Old Testament of who the Messiah was going to be.
Well,
like, show me if it was. And that's my point.
Wisdom of Solomon.
Wisdom of Solomon?
Yeah.
How so?
Well, I mean, it's a Jewish document, right?
Yes. Where does it mention the Messiah being crucified, or
it mentions the Messiah being put to a shameful death.
Do you think?
Go ahead.
Do you think that Jesus expected to be crucified?
I think that
was
Jesus
this the plan
was
all along.
I feel like Jesus was understood to undergo a shameful death that was indicative of him taking on the sins, of everybody, and his death and resurrection would absolve those sins. It would basically destroy them.
So it kind of seems like Dadpool is either regurgitating arguments that he's heard from other people, or he just doesn't understand the position at all. It's one of the two. Which one is it? Then Dadpool says that mythicism is my whole ass personality. I'm wondering exactly how he comes to this conclusion, considering anybody taking a look at my content catalog can see that I talk about a wide range of topics surrounding religion as well as science and politics. And for example, when the topic is on the resurrection of Jesus or anything of that nature, I typically will grant the assumption that Jesus existed in history.
For the sake of this discussion, though, we're assuming that Jesus existed in history, so you can put down your pitchforks right now about that particular topic.
So I'm not exactly sure how it's my whole ass personality. And finally, all of that at the end about the ascension of Isaiah and Philo and all that other stuff, that was just childish. What I think that he's trying to say with this childish display is that mythicism has to jump through a lot of hoops in order for it to make its case. But as we'll see, not only has Dadpool been confronted with most of these arguments before, but he also has no reasonable argument against them.
When it comes to all the sources and references to Jesus in the New Testament and outside the New Testament, suddenly they have all these convenient little tricks to try and dissuade you from believing that they're actually talking about a physical Jesus.
Oh yes, those dastardly tricks like... Hold on, gotta check my notes here. Source criticism. Being able to determine if a source is really an independent account of some historical claim is a really shady-ass trick. Another trick is determining fact from fiction in these sources instead of just ad hoc assuming it's all historical. That at least covers the majority of the New Testament. Paul's sources can be a lot more vague about Jesus and his earthly existence. Oftentimes they can be so vague to the point where the verses that historicists normally use seem to actually argue for the mythicist position rather than the historicist position. Paul's theology, combined with the Greek words that he chooses to use in his epistles, seem to indicate that Paul only ever thought about Jesus as having a celestial divine body rather than an earthly one. I guess the shady trick here is just reading the literature and understanding what it says. I don't see how I'm doing something tricky by just being knowledgeable about Jewish and Christian beliefs as well as the languages that they use.
Yes. Now, I just want to correct for people that this people do this all the time. He says Paul didn't believe in a physical Jesus. That's wrong. The peer-reviewed mythicist thesis, which is the stripped-down Doherty thesis that I passed through peer review at Sheffield Phoenix, and that Lataster also examines in his book for Brill, does not say that it wasn't a physical Jesus. The only thing that's different is where it happened. Where did Jesus acquire a physical body that physically died? That's the only thing that differs. So Paul does believe in a physical Jesus. On mythicism, even on mythicism, Paul believes in a physical Jesus who really did die. He really did become incarnate, really did die, and so on. So it is a physical historical Jesus in that sense. It's just not the Galilean guy that's walking around preaching it, right? So it's stuff that happened in a celestial or otherwise some other realm than ordinary human interaction. So. It just annoys me when people keep saying that Paul didn't believe in it. You say Paul didn't believe in a physical Jesus. Like, you've got this wrong. I also don't say that it is not Jewish, that he didn't have a Jewish body. That's actually scripturally important that the incarnated body be Jewish, in fact, Davidic. That Scripture required this, so obviously it had to be. So that this does not contradict mythicism at all. And in this interview, it's clear that neither of these guys have actually read the peer-reviewed thesis that I developed.
Oh, my mistake. They actually did believe he had a physical body. He just never came down to earth. See, that's how they explain away passages like Romans 1 specifically, where it says Jesus was born of the flesh and of the seed of David. That seed was actually kept in a cosmic sperm bank in outer space.
So the minimal mythicist position is that God fabricated a body for Jesus so that he could be handed over to the demons in the firmament of the heavens. They would then have him suffer, die, and then resurrect, ascending back up into the upper parts of heaven. And one key component to this fleshly body that God fabricated for Jesus is that it had to be made of Davidic flesh. And the thing is that all of the supporting information for this hypothesis is found in the scriptures, or would have been readily accepted by the early Jewish Christians. The life of Adam and Eve, or sometimes referred to as the apocalypse of Moses, has not only Adam but also Eve and Abel being buried in paradise that exists in the third heaven. Other Jewish texts, like the third apocalypse of Baruch, have Hades existing alongside paradise in the heavens. Philo even has a pre-existent Moses that was a divine figure prior to God giving him a body so that he could come down and reign over the Jews as king, and then after he died, he ascended back up into heaven to become an immortal.
At times, Philo goes even further and imagines Moses as a kind of pre-existent divine being sent to earth for a time. Quote, "And even when God sent him as alone to the earthly sphere and caused him to dwell there, he fitted him with no ordinary excellence, such as that which kings and rulers have, but he appointed him as God, placing all the bodily region and the mind which rules it in subjection and slavery to him." End quote. Sacrifices 8-10. Like other specifically favored humans who had a particularly close relationship with God, so close that Moses himself could be considered in some sense divine, at the end of his life Moses was highly exalted by God and made immortal. Quote, "When he was about to depart from hence to heaven, to take up his abode there, and leaving this mortal life to become immortal, having been summoned by the Father, who now changed him, having previously been a double being composed of soul and body, into the nature of a single body, transforming him wholly and entirely into a most son-like mind." End quote. Life of Moses 2:28. Dr. Bart Ehrman, How Jesus Became God.
The Ascension of Isaiah is an example of later Christians developing a similar idea for Jesus. Paul, coincidentally, also considers paradise to be located in the third heaven. Specifically, the body of Davidic flesh is necessitated by scriptures. Being able to find a reference to God jerking David off, palming his seed, and then later creating a Messiah from that seed is easily found in 2 Samuel 7:12-14.
"And when thy days be fulfilled, and thou shalt sleep with thy fathers, I will set up thy seed after thee, which shall proceed out of thy bowels, and I will establish his kingdom. He shall build an house for my name, and I will establish the throne of his kingdom forever. I will be his father, and he shall be my son."
This is not something that we've willed into existence in the scriptures. We also haven't twisted the scriptures to read this. God just literally says it in the passage. This isn't anything new, and it's always been in the mythicist hypothesis. Captain Dadpool just has to act like it's a super convenient fact that mythicism is parsimonious with the evidence we have.
Yeah. What about passages like Galatians 4, where it says that Jesus was born of a woman, born under the law? Well, friends, stop me if you've heard this one. Paul was being allegorical here.
Yeah, because Paul literally says it's an allegory explaining how Jesus' sacrifice gives us eternal salvation. I'm not sure how this is a shady or crazy interpretation. Also, he seems to be skipping the part of the mythicist hypothesis on this particular topic where we discuss the Greek words that Paul uses. Paul uses the word genomai, which can be used to mean born, but can also be used to mean to become or to be made, or in our modern sense, manufactured. And this is how Paul uses this word in relation to other divinely manufactured bodies. Paul refers to not only Adam's body, but our future resurrection bodies using the same word genomai. What this does is it establishes a trend coming from Paul, being that when he's referencing these divinely created bodies, he's more likely to use this word genomai in order to discuss how the bodies were created or how they came into being. And this is in stark contrast to his use of the word genao in reference to literal physical births here on earth. Many people like to say that born of a woman is a common idiom in the Jewish culture, and it was. But Also, it's important to acknowledge that the idiom constructed in the Septuagint is noticeably different than how Paul constructs the idiom. The idiom in the Septuagint uses the word genao to denote literal physical human birth, while Paul chooses to use the word genomai for some reason. Again, this further reinforces the trend that Paul is using genomai for a specific reason, and he chooses that word over genao, which is more explicit about human births. So what could that purpose be, considering that genomai is used for divinely constructed bodies? As far as Paul's concerned, it would seem that Paul considered Jesus' body to be divinely constructed. I don't understand how this would be considered tricky or some kind of twisted wordplay with what Paul is saying. It's just understanding the language and understanding how people use words. So at the very least, there are multiple reasons to consider that this verse is just too vague to make a determination. And at the very worst, it seems to reinforce this idea that Paul considered Jesus to have a divinely created body. Of course, all of this is mainly attributed to the fact that it's contained in an allegory, but also the words that Paul used reinforce that idea. And I mean, you can disagree with me on this. That's fine. What you can't say, though, is that I'm presenting an ad hoc argument that has no evidence behind it. Another thing to note is that I've already discussed this particular point with Dadpool in our live stream.
But
so
Paul says Jesus was born of a woman. How does he?
That's Galatians 4:4. That's wrapped up in an allegory. And it's multiply, and it is.
Come on.
It's
come on.
Come on. What I mean,
how is Paul using an allegory? You have to make it an allegory. He
literally says that he's using an allegory. He says this is an allegory. The allegory is that Jesus was made flesh, quote unquote, born of a woman or whatnot, to have Judaic flesh, which I think that he did have a flesh and blood body. It was just a celestial body that was manufactured by God. And if you look at the Greek, that's exactly what that's the words that Paul uses better fits a manufactured understanding rather than an actual born of type of thing. But the allegory is that born into the flesh, born into sin, and then when he dies and resurrects, that's when he's sinless. And so it's to explain that sort of transition from a sinful body to a pure sinless body. And I mean, he says it in at the very end of chapter 3 of Galatians that this is an allegory, right. And then later on in Galatians 4, he also says this is an allegory.
By the way, everyone, I pretty much already know everything what John's going to say. He probably pretty much knows everything that I'm going to say in this discussion. So,
what about 1 Corinthians 11:23, where Paul says Jesus was betrayed? By whom? If he never left the firmament, who betrayed him?
So, this is the Lord's Supper, not the Last Supper, as some people would say. In that section, the word used for betray can also just simply mean to deliver or hand over. One reason that we might want to take the hand over or deliver definition for this word rather than betray, as most translations would render this, is how this exact word is used in the suffering servant passage in the Old Testament. That would be Isaiah 52 and 53. Isaiah 53:6 uses the same phrase that Paul uses in his Lord's Supper section. But generally in the Old Testament, it's rendered as saying that the Lord gave up the Messiah for our sins. This is a similar sentiment expressed by Paul in other sections of his epistles, like Romans 8:3.
For what the law was powerless to do because it was weakened by the flesh, God did by sending his own Son in the likeness of sinful flesh to be a sin offering, and so he condemned sin in the flesh. Romans 8:3.
So, who gave Jesus up as a sin offering? God did, because that's exactly what Paul tells us God did. Another devastating blow to this particular section is that Paul only ever says that he gets it from the Lord. He doesn't say that he got it from anyone specifically here on earth. He claims to have had a vision or a hallucination. You know, it seems a bit tricky to me if you try to twist Paul's words into this being a recollection of a historical event, considering all the direct evidence that we surveyed in this section.
Well, they'll point to the beginning of the passage and be like, this is just something that Paul received from the Lord. And why did Jesus also say in the same passage, break bread, this is my flesh, drink the wine, this is my blood? Oh, I forgot. He actually does have a physical body. Don't know why I keep forgetting that.
Right. Anyways, the fact that this is Paul's hallucination, which he directly tells us in this passage by referring to the Lord as being the one that gave it to him, means that it, by definition, is not a historical event. This meal is meant to be the Passover meal. So that means that Jesus has to be the sacrificial offering. So again, it is necessary for Jesus to be the sacrificial bread and wine that is consumed. And at this point, yes, Paul would have considered Jesus to have a physical body. As far as evidence for historicity goes, it doesn't really matter if Jesus had a physical body for this hallucination or not. This all happened in a hallucination or vision, which makes a discussion on Jesus's physical body rather moot. At least that's the minimal mythicist position on this particular hallucination by Paul. You know, I kind of feel like Ricky may need to reread that book he showed earlier. So, literally taking Paul at his word does not seem shady or tricky. Kind of sounds like the reasonable thing to do. Seems like the tricky thing to do would be to twist Paul's words into this being a historical event that we don't have any evidence for.
Well, then Paul says he knows Jesus' brother. Oh, well, he doesn't actually mean brother. He just means, like, follower.
So, for this one, Paul uses the word adelphos, which can mean a blood relative, but also can mean a fictive kinship. What we have to do is look at the context to see what Paul could mean by this. So, to start with, the phrase is brother of the Lord. And the first thing right off the bat that kind of throws a wrench into this whole blood relative interpretation is the use of the word Lord. Jesus wasn't given that title or wasn't considered the Lord until he ascended into heaven. That's when he became the Lord, and the Lord is a celestial title. The structure of Galatians 1:19 seems to indicate that there is a distinction to be made between Cephas and James. It could be the case that Paul was trying to distinguish between a literal brother and an apostle, but it also works with Paul trying to distinguish between a general Christian and an apostle. Of course, some historicists try to twist this into saying, oh, well, Cephas wasn't a Christian then, but that's not how the structure and how that binary association is understood. So we have to ask, is there any evidence in Paul that would support this alternate interpretation of Galatians 1:19? In order to answer that, we need to examine Paul's theology on the family of God, but also how he refers to other Christians. And as it turns out, Paul refers to fellow baptized Christians as being brothers and sisters. Paul even indicates that Jesus is the first of many brethren, and that baptism is what inducts you into the family of God. What this ends up accomplishing is muddying the waters of this particular phrase, brother of the Lord. Considering all of the context surrounding this phrase, at best, it's too vague to make a determination, and at worst, it just says that James is a general Christian. The only pushback that I've ever heard on this interpretation for brother of the Lord is that it's just the natural reading of this phrase that indicates a blood relationship. Do you really think that a blood relation would have been the natural reading for Paul? It seems like Paul referencing fellow baptized Christians as brothers and sisters is a problem for this interpretation. Again, I'm not having to twist any information. This is understanding the context surrounding this passage and who wrote it. This is normal procedure when analyzing ancient texts. It feels a bit tricky to ignore all of this context for a predetermined conclusion. This has been explained to him before. It's just that now he's being a little bit more dramatic about it.
I can't, like, that's one big hang up for me is how Paul uses words. A lot like adelphos with the brother. Because when Paul references people that are brothers, he does it in a different way than saying like the brother of the Lord. The word used there is ambiguous enough to where it could mean both things. And you have to look at how Paul uses the familial relationships in order to determine what he could possibly mean. Because there's this one passage, I believe it's in Romans 9:5. Anyways, he's talking about how he's complaining about other people being able to bring believing wives along with us, but the word used is the feminine version of adelphos. And in that exact same passage, it also talks about the brothers of the Lord. So in that case, you've either got to specially plead for the brothers of the Lord being like literal brothers, or Paul was talking about the apostles engaging in incestuous relationships. So it's like, which one are you really going to defend? If you have it both ways, you're kind of specially pleading.
So this is where we're going to go full circle back to Occam's razor.
Okay.
What you mentioned how like these words are ambiguous enough that they can mean this and they could. So my question is, what's more likely, that Jesus was born of a woman and had a brother, or that he was created out of the seed of David in the firmament of heaven and had a disciple person, whatever the word for brother means? Like, which one's more likely? He was a dude that was born and had a brother, lived a life, died for saying that he was the Messiah, which wasn't weird at the time again, or that
I don't think that Jesus had like a brother in the familial, like in the blood relation kind of way. That's what
I'm saying. Like you said, that term is ambiguous enough that it doesn't necessarily mean an actual brother.
Right. Adelphos could mean a blood relation or a fictive kinship.
Right.
So how do you determine which one is which in Paul?
So James was just a
general Christian.
Even a kin in a traditional definition means brother. But I understand how kinship is used. Although I feel like the word kin being used for a friend is a fairly Anyway.
Think of fraternities, in sororities.
Yeah.
They call each other brothers, sisters, but they're not literally brothers and sisters.
I don't know that was a thing back then. As much as it is now.
That's literally the definition in Koine Greek of the word adelphos. You can look it up in Strong's Concordance. It means either a blood relation or a fictive kinship. It literally says fictive kinship, meaning it's a non-literal like blood relation.
Okay, so they were frat bros. So
yeah. God bros is what my wife said.
God bros. I like it.
What about the two mentions of Jesus by Josephus? Well, one of them's a forgery, and the other one's talking about a different Jesus.
What about this piece of evidence? Well, here are some well-reasoned arguments against this piece of evidence. That's the feeling that I get from this. It's a bit weird. A growing segment of the scholarship is turning away from the Testimonium Flavianum as evidence of Jesus, and for good reason. I've actually got a video extensively covering why the Testimonium Flavianum was most likely not written by Josephus. If you want to see that video, check out the description below. It's over there on my Clips channel. As for the James reference, Dr. Carrier used the normal methods of textual criticism in order to identify this as an interpolation, and it was probably an accidental scribal interpolation too. The phrase, who was called Christ, grammatically looks like a marginal note that could have been written by a scribe. We know that scribes made marginal notes just like this all the time when they were transcribing books. This interpolation is further supported by the fact that Jesus ben Damnius is mentioned at the end of the passage as taking over the position that James had held before his death. This was commonly done in this type of situation when one person was related to another, so it would make sense if Jesus ben Damnius was actually related to James. Otherwise, it goes unexplained explained as to why Jesus ben Damnius was randomly chosen to fill the seat once held by James. One thing complicating the non-interpolation argument is the fact that Josephus doesn't seem to explain what a Christ is in this section, and he isn't writing to Jews or Christians, which would be the audience that would know what a Christ was. His audience wouldn't have known what a Christ is. And in other passages, Josephus goes into detail explaining certain groups or certain titles, when his audience wouldn't necessarily know what those titles and groups were. And in other passages, when Josephus introduces a new group or title, he's sure to either explain it to his audience or refer back to an explanation that was previously put forth. This is absent from the passage. The pushback against this is just that, oh, his audience definitely would have known what a Christ was, or that his audience knew to refer back to the Testimonium Flavianum. But this is not the typical behavior of Josephus. Another point to note here is that the way that James dies in this passage is different from the Christian tradition about the supposed brother of Jesus. In Christian tradition, James, the brother of the Lord, is killed in different ways by different people for different reasons. Seems a little odd to connect these two figures, doesn't it? Of course, maybe I'm just being shady by, let me check my notes, noticing fucking differences. So, by using the normal methodology of textual critics, this argument has stood against criticism, and currently, there's no coherent argument against it. It's a completely reasonable approach to this section, and isn't twisting anything around. It seems a lot trickier if you were to ignore all of the issues with this passage for your predetermined conclusion of authenticity.
What about Tacitus? Oh, he's not actually talking about Jesus either.
No. Tacitus is just regurgitating 2nd century Christian beliefs. Even New Testament scholars like Robert Van Voorst and R.T. France agree that this is not independent information about Jesus. So Ricky seems to just be 23 years out of date for this? Should probably catch up on that, secondary scholarship.
What about the QM&L documents that were used in conjunction with other sources to write the Gospels? Oh, those are just hypothetical documents. They don't exist. Even though I've literally heard Carrier say, yes, it's possible that the Gospel authors used multiple sources. But not Q, M, or L?
Yeah, it's possible, but that doesn't mean that those sources are plausible. Also, these sources are hypothetical. We don't know what was actually in them or if they even existed at all. These were sources that were proposed to solve some perceived issue in the synoptic problem. Instead of admitting that people in ancient history could have just made shit up, they ended up making their own shit up and putting it in the QM&L documents. And the core issue with using these documents to prove historicity is that we can't perform any kind of source criticism on them. We can't determine what is independent information from what is fabricated. If anyone can tell me how you would do that on sources that don't exist, I would really appreciate it if you would enlighten me, because I have no fucking clue. And it's not a tricky thing to dismiss fabricated or hypothetical documentation. Nowhere else in historical research are hypothetical sources used quite like they are in biblical and New Testament studies. It seems far more tricky to just make shit up and proclaim that it's independent information without being able to actually prove that it's independent information.
So see how mythicists will insist you give them their very generous interpretation of the extra-biblical Old Testament text, but when confronted with the New Testament text, they have all these convenient workarounds. That's not how scholarship works.
I don't understand this part. We have evidence of Paul reinterpreting scripture, and we even have evidence of Philo reinterpreting scripture. It's not our weird interpretation of things. It's how Paul and Philo and other Jews like them were reinterpreting their own scriptures. So this isn't weird or generous on our side at all. This is just what was happening. We're just acknowledging that it did happen. This is important to the context surrounding the beginning of Christianity. Also, the arguments surrounding the New Testament texts, like the epistles or the gospels, they're not convenient. The minimal mythicist position is literally just considering the full context of all of those arguments. Does Ricky not do this for arguments about God or anything else? You're trying to tell me he doesn't consider the wider context for claims on God or other topics to determine if it's reasonable or not?
Now, there's a common response that mythicists make when responding to historicists that John accused me of doing in that clip, and that is waving the flag of the ad populum fallacy, right? This is not that.
Well, he literally said that he rejects my position because it's fringe, and that I have to adhere to fringe positions in order to support it. If we look at the definition of fringe, it would be a position that's not held by the mainstream. Well, what does mainstream mean? That some position is compatible with the prevailing attitudes in a community. Well, what are the synonyms for mainstream? Oh, could it be popular? I'm literally not trying to be tricky or anything. This is just how words work. Regardless of how Ricky spins this, he said that he was only rejecting my position because it's not part of the mainstream, which is fine. Plenty of people do that. I just don't consider it a good reason, and I don't think other people should consider it a good reason either.
This is not that, and I'll explain why this is not that. When a new idea is brought forward in scholarship, it's not immediately fringe. It's just a new idea. And it goes through the rigorous process of being scrutinized by other scholars, checking your data, seeing if your information is correct. And if it is and sounds good and more scholars get on board, it may even become mainstream eventually. But it only becomes fringe if it gets rejected by pretty much everybody, and instead you double down.
Well, if a position isn't compatible with the mainstream in some community, then it seems like the complement to that would be fringe. Am I missing something? Is this not how words work? Is there some new category now of scholarship that's labeled as new? Which basically the only difference between it and fringe seems to be how many scholars have analyzed it and accepted it? If that's the metric, then by Ricky's own standards, the minimal mythicist position is still in the new category awaiting to be scrutinized by scholars. Luckily, Carrier is very public about his reviews of the criticism for On the Historicity of Jesus and Jesus from Outer Space. And so far, between both books, there have been 29 reviews. 4 have been favorable towards the position, including Lataster, Price, Lauren, and Covington. The rest of the reviews either obviously didn't read the position or had incoherent arguments against the material. So when does this scrutiny happen? Because it seems like when people actually read the material, they have constructive feedback making the position stronger or are convinced of the position. I wonder why these scholars refuse to actually read the position and criticize it fairly. How can Ricky claim that the minimal mythicist position has been scrutinized and rejected when the only ones to actually read the position are either convinced or nearly convinced? The only people that seem to reject the position either haven't actually read the arguments, haven't understood the arguments, or are too Christian to accept the position.
Insist that all these scholars that are critiquing your work are wrong, even high-profile ones, and you may even resort to more personal attacks.
So his argumentation here is just completely ignorant. And it's not because he's an amateur, it's just because he's lazy, I think. Like, he just doesn't check these things. And it's laziness combined with arrogance, right? So it's not like he's lazy and says, well, I haven't looked into that. I'm too lazy, I'm not gonna. No, he pretends to know as if he's done it. And it's the combination of those two vices that kind of make Bart Ehrman what he is in this debate. And it's shameful, and I wish he wouldn't act like this. There's no reason for him to do that.
I agree.
Okay. And I agree with Dr. Carrier on this position because I feel like Bart Ehrman is lazy and arrogant about it. And that's demonstrably true. As I mentioned before, it's a bit misleading to say that scholars are critiquing the minimal mythicist position when more than half of them don't even know what's in the hypothesis. The scholars that have seemed to have read OHJ or Jesus from Outer Space end up either totally convinced, nearly convinced, or have no issue with it. How can Ricky say that these scholars are critiquing the position when they don't even know what the position is?
Of course you do, John. How far do you have to have your head up your own ass to say those things about Bart fucking Ehrman? So what does Bart Ehrman have to say about Carrier? Well, this was posted on his blog exactly a year ago. He is a trained scholar of history and classics with a PhD from Columbia University, an impressive credential. In my book, Did Jesus Exist?, I speak of him as a smart scholar with bona fide credentials. I do, of course, wholeheartedly agree with him on issues relating to the historical Jesus, but I have tried to take his views seriously and give him the respect he deserves. Richard Carrier, on many of you know, has written a scathing review of Did Jesus Exist? On his Free Thought blog. He indicates that my book is full of errors, that is, misforms more than it informs, and it provides false information, and it is worse than bad, and it officially sucks. The attacks are sustained throughout his lengthy posts, and they often become personal. He indicates that Ehrman doesn't actually know what he's talking about. He claims that I speak with absurd hyperbole, that my arguments make me look irresponsible, that I am guilty of sloppy work, that I misrepresent my opponents and misinform the public, that what I write is crap, that I am guilty of arrogant, dogmatic, and irresponsible thinking, and I am incompetent, make hack mistakes, and do not act like a real scholar. Again, if you're a mythicist because you just don't buy it, that's fine. But know that these are the arguments that are used to defend that position. And these are the scholars that you are aligning yourself with.
Okay, I really don't care about the back and forth between Ehrman and Carrier. I can agree with Carrier's conclusions about Dr. Ehrman because I've analyzed Ehrman's arguments against the mythicist position and I've come to the same conclusions. That's why I agreed with Carrier in the interview. It also kind of seems like Ricky is getting upset on behalf of Bart Ehrman. I'm not in a cult of personality like a lot of these historicists seem to be. A lot of these creators seem to act like these scholars are above reproach. We've seen this with Neil Sendelak, Jacob Berman, and their dedicated audiences, and now Captain Dadpool. I don't know why they act like this. Dr. Carrier isn't above reproach, and neither is Dr. Ehrman. People should be able to criticize scholars if they feel like they need to be criticized. I will say one thing, though. I don't like misrepresentations of reality. So if you say something that is just simply not true and you can't demonstrate it, that's when I have a problem, but that's mainly because it's just not true. The way that Ricky talks in this section makes it seem like even if Dr. Ehrman was wrong, provably wrong about something, Ricky wouldn't correct him or wouldn't say anything to correct him. That's where Ricky and I are just different. I would and have said something. I would and have had an issue. If I had an issue with Dr. Carrier's position, then I would have said something, but I don't have an issue. Well, that's all for Ricky's video. I think the only thing that is different from our live stream conversation is that Ricky was allowed to cover a whole lot more ground than he would have been in a second discussion or live stream setting. In my own personal opinion, given the arguments that Ricky has put forth, I don't think that he's either read the mythicist position or he just simply doesn't understand it. But keep in mind, I don't care that he disagrees with me about minimal mythicism, even if it is just an argument from popularity. I do mind that he represents the position as disregarding the arguments with no good reason. The fact that we can explain the questions that historicists have doesn't mean we're just hand-waving away the arguments. What we're doing is demonstrating the explanatory power of the hypothesis. It's not the minimal mythicist's fault that Ricky and other historicists can't poke holes in the hypothesis. It honestly sounds like it's a problem with their evidence and arguments. Thank you, heathens, for joining me today for this excruciatingly long video, but hopefully you got some good information about the minimal mythicist position and why we can't explain all the arguments that historicists have. If you will, please go down below and let me know what you thought about the content of this video, or the historicist arguments for Jesus, or the mythicist arguments for Jesus. Let me know down in the comments below. And hey, while you're down there, why don't you smash that like button and subscribe if you like this kind of video. the drama kind of video. Don't forget to stand up and use your voice. Bye, heathens.